Which pop-punk band is the greatest of all time? For some, it's New Found Glory. For more, it's Blink-182. A few of you might even go super old school and say The Descendants. But what about Fenix TX? Okay, with just a couple of albums to their name, Fenix TX probably aren't vying for that GOAT status. But for a little while at the beginning of the millennium, it seemed like these guys were unstoppable. With tracks like All My Fault, they almost perfected the genre. Seriously, pop-punk doesn't get much better than this. So what went wrong? Why aren't we talking about Fenix TX in the same breath as Blink or NFG? Here's the story of how Fenix TX exploded onto the scene and then fell off the planet. The Fenix TX story begins back in 1995 in Texas, but not in the San Antonio suburb of Phoenix like you might expect. Instead, the band were from Houston, and in the mid-90s, they were barely even a band. They were just a bunch of teenage kids playing music and having a blast. They did have a name though. Back then, they were called RiverFenix, after the late actor, and they were about to have their own record too. In 1996, when the band headed down to Deep Dot Studios in Houston and cut their first EP, GBOH. What does GBOH stand for? You don't want to know. You won't find the GBOH record anywhere these days. It came out on the ultra-independent Fuzzgun label and had only a limited release. However, it was a big step for the band. The lineup on that first EP, Damon De La Paz on vocals and guitars, Adam Lewis on bass, Donnie Reyes on drums, and Will Salazar on guitars, would become the core membership of the band for years to come. The guys might have been goofing off with their first EP, but it did have some solid tracks on it. Minimum Wage and the EP's title track would both be re-recorded and re-released later on the band's first full album, the album that would launch them into the pantheon of pop-punk superstardom. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. It's still 1996, we're still in Houston, and Fenix TX are still called RiverFenix. With their demo EP now recorded, the band headed out on a nationwide tour with friends and fellow pop-punk up-and-comers homegrown. While they were out on the road, they distributed their demo to labels with a little more reach than Fuzzgun. One such label was Mojo Records, the home of Goldfinger and Real Big Fish. The label very nearly added RiverFenix to their roster in 1996, but the deal fell through. However, the story doesn't stop there. Interning at Mojo at the time were Richard and Stephanie Rains. The Rains had a dream of starting their own label, but they needed a band to get things started. The timing was perfect. The legendary label Drive-Thru Records was born, and the four punk kids from Houston became their first artist. Drive-Thru and RiverFenix was a match made in heaven. The new partnership worked on the band's debut album throughout 1997, releasing the self-titled record that December. Limited to 5,000 copies, the album sold out so fast it would make your head spin. Drive-Thru printed up 5,000 more. Again, they sold out. So Drive-Thru knocked out another 5,000 and sold every last one of them. So at least 15,000 kids heard that debut album. And one of those kids was pretty influential. Mark Hoppus loved what the guys were doing, the sharp and snarky pop-punk with manic teenage energy and adolescent humor. They probably reminded him a little of himself and his own band. Oh, and De La Paz was dating Mark Hoppus' sister at the time, which probably helped. It was a done deal. Hoppus would book RiverFenix to support Blink on their next tour, and would even manage the band. Everything was going great. The next big things in pop-punk had famous friends, great tunes, and bags of energy. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turned out, almost everything. But first, there was more good stuff. Drive-Thru had given it their all, but they were dealing with a band that was just too hot to handle. With so much demand for their music, the group needed to be on a major label. That label was MCA, the same label as manager and mentor Mark Hoppus and Blink-182. After agreeing a distribution deal with Drive-Thru, MCA signed RiverFenix in 1999. So far so good. But there was a problem. RiverFenix had been dead for 6 years, but it turns out you can't just use someone else's name and make money off it, even if they're no longer around. When RiverFenix had been just a bunch of high school kids making high-octane pop-punk, no one really minded. But now they were on a major label and about to hit the big time. Now it was an issue. So RiverFenix dropped the river and added the two-letter abbreviation of their home state. Fenix TX was born. Next, the band got back into the studio to re-record that self-titled album. The MCA Fenix TX version of the debut is more polished than the Drive-Thru RiverFenix version, and it has a bigger, chunkier sound. The band had already had a bit of a radio hit with Speechless, but the improved recording quality and massive resources of MCA gave Fenix TX the kickstart they needed to explode into the mainstream. With All My Fault, Fenix TX did exactly that. The single is a stunning slice of pop punk, with a razor-sharp edge that perfectly encapsulates that turn of the millennium scene. It's well deserving of its place on lists of best pop punk track of all time, but perhaps the track encapsulated that scene a little too well. While most people loved the debut record, some critics were a little dismissive, calling it a good Blink-182 album. Blink-182 are great, and maybe this was meant as a compliment, but to a band who are out there trying to do their own thing, it feels like a bit of a slam. Still, Fenix TX had a hit single, a hit album, and a ton of new fans. They were tearing it up in multiple countries with the likes of New Found Glory, and smashing out sets on the Warped Tour. There was plenty to be positive about, but those accusations of just being Blink-182 clones must have stung a bit. If Fenix TX were going to spread their own wings, they need to step out from the shadow of their more famous friends. And this was going to be way harder than they first thought. That cool unit of great friends the guys had created was already falling apart. Kind of out of nowhere, Donnie Reyes quit the band. This meant Damon de la Paz had to shift from guitar to drum duties. Fine, but that just meant the band now needed a new guitarist rather than a new drummer. In March 2001, their prayers were answered when James Love joined the group. There was no time to shed tears over departing members. Fenix TX had a new album to promote. In May, they released Lechuza. Cool sounding name for sure, but an alarming name too. In Mexican tradition, the Lechuza is a folkloric creature in the form of an owl. This entity can cause physical harm, or it can be a portent of doom, forecasting tragedy to follow. Either way, if you see one, you're gonna have a bad time. So this was how Fenix TX were gonna step out of Blink-182 shadow? By jettisoning the fun and energy in favor of something dark and demonic? Well, not exactly. Don't forget, this is the record with Phoebe Cates on it, an entire track dedicated to a fantasy about the Fast Times at Ridgemont High actress. But as a whole, Lechuza did sound different. It's certainly heavier across much of the record, sacrificing a little bit of pop-punk melody in favor of hardcore heft. The songs became a bit more complex too. Take Threesome, a track that became a big international hit for the band. Threesome takes a staccato opening riff, reminiscent of something like The Offspring's Self-Esteem or Green Day's Brain Stew, and contrast this with a soaring vocal line with stunning effect. By the time the chorus rolls around, the song has morphed into something verging on emo and post-hardcore, with clean guitars and a catchy, pleading vocal. It was an instant classic. Sounds like everything was just fine, right? In fact, it wasn't fine. It wasn't fine at all. First up, the reviews. They weren't great. Lechuza is fantastic in parts, but it's a bit of a mishmash. The heavier style tracks sounded a little out of place against things like Phoebe Cates. And then there were the lyrics. Tracks like Beating a Dead Horse are pretty damning about the creative differences fracturing the band's dynamic. The track's vocals are some of the angriest Fenix TX ever recorded, sounding like Hot Water Music's Chuck Reagan stepping on Legos. I hate you, can't stand you, holding back but I want to say much more. Every day gets worse. Lots of bands have angry lyrics. In pop punk, anger is one of the key elements. But these lyrics, they felt a little personal, like they were actual evidence of the infighting that was taking place within the band. In fact, this was exactly what the lyrics were about. In an interview from December 2002, Will Salazar came clean on what had gone on. He described how tension had been building for a long time, with lots of arguments, basically arguments over writing. Life in the band wasn't fun, according to Salazar, and it hadn't been fun for a long time. Was this something fans should worry about? Were pop-punk's brand new darlings about to fall apart just when they were hitting their stride? Simple answer? Yes. And yes. Yes, fans should be worried. And yes, Fenix TX were falling apart. In the aftermath of Lechuza, it became pretty clear that things were not going well for Fenix TX. Salazar had his own vision for the band, and this vision was not shared by the other two founding members. All the infighting got to be too much. James Love had joined Fenix TX to be part of something special. Instead, he found himself caught in the middle of a family feud. He left the band not long after Lechuza came out, and was replaced first by Dennis Hill, and then by Chris Lewis, no relation to Adam. Perhaps it was time to take a breath. Fenix TX had gone right to the brink, but they were still just about together. If the guys could all just get along, maybe everything was gonna be fine. Spoiler alert, they couldn't get along. It wasn't gonna be fine. De La Paz and Adam Lewis rejected the new members. While the group were writing their third album, De La Paz and Lewis announced they would have no further part in the band. And if they were going, then Salazar could not continue by himself. In September 2002, Fenix TX became no more. Was it really all over? Or was there more to come from Houston's finest? Fenix TX might have been done, but the guys were still making their own music. De La Paz and Adam Lewis got back together with James Love and went on kind of a weird trip, forming the experimental band Big Black Boat with singer Anthony Scalamari. The group then became Ch-Ch-Ch Ha 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 and eventually Sing the Body Electric. If the infighting in Fenix TX had got bad, then Sing the Body Electric was off the scale. The band broke up in 2005, with a flurry of angry social media posts exchanged between Scalamari and the others. Salazar and Chris Lewis were a little more successful, forming the grunge rock outfit Denver Harbor. Denver Harbor only outlasted Sing the Body Electric by a year, but at least they managed to release an album. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, and time is a healer. A few years spent apart softened much of the bad feelings between the band members, and Fenix TX got back together briefly in 2005. They played a few live dates and even released a live album, Purple Rain and Blood. But the band were very clear that they were not back together for good. 2 farewell tours were announced. That's right, 2. The boys were really giving us the long goodbye. As it turned out, the tours were a disaster. Scheduling problems with Denver Harbor led to dates getting cancelled at the last minute, and De La Paz left the band altogether halfway through the first round of shows. Ahead of the European leg of the tour, Salazar was diagnosed with polyps on his vocal cords. Yet again, the dates got cancelled. Maybe these aborted goodbyes changed something for the band. Perhaps they took all these disasters as a divine message. It wasn't time to quit just yet. Signing a deal with Cybertrax, the label run by Aaron El Jefe Abeta of NoFX fame, and wife Jen, Fenix TX recorded Cree EP in 2016. The record might not have been vintage Fenix TX, and it definitely wasn't a full album, but it was something. And after 14 years of absolutely nothing, that meant a lot. The last decade has been rocky for Fenix TX and tinged with tragedy. The band have made several attempts to get their classic lineup back together. It kind of worked out here and there. Damon De La Paz returned to the fold in 2016 and remained in the band for 7 years until he parted company with Fenix TX in 2023. Donnie Reyes replaced him. I guess the 2 RiverFenix OGs passed each other in the revolving door. But while Fenix TX were struggling to get the 1995 lineup back together, life was dealing one of the band's members a much harsher hand. In 2021, Adam Lewis received a crushing diagnosis. He had pancreatic cancer. Lewis had been with Fenix TX since the very start, and he stayed with the band that meant so much to him until the very end. In June 2024, Lewis passed away, aged just 45. The sad passing of Adam Lewis really puts the whole thing into perspective. Sure, musicians don't always see eye to eye. Differing visions, conflicting musical directions, these things have a habit of getting in the way of the truth, that making great tunes with your best friends has to come first. So, to bring it back full circle, Fenix TX are not the greatest pop-punk band of all time. But for a little while, they hinted that they could be. Amazingly, they're also still together. They're still playing shows and honoring the memory of their departed friend Adam Lewis. Go catch them next time they come through your town. Remind yourself of how jaw-droppingly awesome pop-punk can be when it's done right. Thanks for joining me again. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know what you'd like me to cover next in the comments. And stay right where you are for another pop-punk journey coming right up.